This session is on impact fee methodology from principles to practice. This is a subject near and dear to my heart because as a consultant, I've got to figure out how to calculate a fee. And so I need a methodology that's defensible, consistent with legal principles, and it's not always easy. But I think it also is applicable not just to consultants, but to anybody that works in local government that's involved in an impact fee update, whether it's you're sitting on a selection committee to select a consultant, whether you're a project manager for an impact fee update, whether you're in charge of administering the impact fee to understand how that fee was calculated. I mean, there's general rules about what you can spend money on, for example, but it does depend on the methodology. You've got a plan-based fee that says we're collecting a fee. One of the examples this morning, we're collecting a fee for an aquatic center, but now we want to spend it on something else. So, it's important to understand, what was the methodology and how was that fee calculated, and have just at least a basic understanding about how that happens. Okay, so just kind of an overview of the session. I'm going to do this little introductory presentation. In fact, Bob Spencer is going to actually follow up with a little bit of his as well. We're going to try to keep that brief and really focus on the panel discussion, which we have these empty chairs here. And I guess we need we'll pull up another one so I can sit down too. I don't want to stay at the podium the whole time. And hopefully we'll get some discussion going among the panel. We'll try to get some participation with the audience at the end, hopefully. We're trying to film this, so it's kind of hard to film the discussion part, the Q&A back and forth with the audience. So I think we're going to try to do the panel, try to get the discussion. I'm going to try to set the stage, at least with my perspective here, and then ask the panel to sort of, tear it to shreds and tell me what I got wrong. Or, we just want to see what makes sense. Okay, and so for our panel, I'm Clancy Mullen with Duncan Associates out of Austin, Texas. We also have Carson Bice with Tischler Bice out of Bethesda, Maryland. We have Bob Spencer right here with Urban Economics out of Oakland, and Susan Shuttle with an attorney in Sarasota. And basically your firm name is your name, right? Okay. All right. So that's kind of the game plan. So what are the legal principles? We just had Tyson and Jerry and those guys kind of laid out, and Susan as well, laid out pretty well, I think, the legal framework. What are the legal principles? Now, I'll just summarize what I get out of it. Impact fees should not exceed the cost of the needed facilities. Pretty straightforward. The fees should be proportional to the demand generated. You want it to be more like a user fee, not like a tax. Well, like we don't like this development, we're going to charge it more, but we want to encourage this, we're going to charge it less. New development should not be required to pay for a higher level of service than has been provided for existing development. Sometimes referred to as we don't want to use impact fees to fix sins of the past. So we haven't kept up with growth. Now we want what remaining growth we have to pay for all of the problems. And then finally, new development should not have to pay for the same level of service, both through impact fees and other taxes or fees. So we don't want to double charge. And that gets more into the revenue credits, which is a separate session. So basically, pretty much explain it in this slide here. Impact fee methodology basically consists of two components. You got the cost per service unit and the revenue credit per service unit. So the cost minus the credit is the net cost. That's what you charge, right? We're going to focus on the cost per service unit. Because for methodologies, different methodologies, do you use plan-based? Do you use some other approach? This is what we're getting at is the cost per service unit. Now, how you do the proportionality stuff, what your demand schedule is, if it's trip generation rates, or you're doing peak hour, or you're doing whatever you're doing, can vary between methodologies. It isn't inherent in the methodology itself. So really what's inherent is how do we come up with that cost per service unit? So that's what we're going to focus on. And how you do the credits, the other component, is, like I said, that's another whole topic for discussion. And service unit, just to define terms here, everybody's not familiar. It's just a generic term. In other words, it's saying cost per dwelling unit. Sometimes it's not a dwelling unit. Sometimes it's a smallest meter size, right? Or sometimes it's something else. You might use population rather than dwelling units as your service unit. But it's a standard unit of demand for service. All right. So there's two basic methodologies. In my view, there's really only two basic methodologies. I mean, you have sort of blends, sort of combinations I'll talk about, but really there's two. Standards-based, I'm calling, and plan-based. So standard-based is also called sometimes consumption-based, particularly when you're talking about road impact fees. When you're talking about water and wastewater, it's often called buy-in, but it's basically the same thing. You've got a simple system-wide level of service ratio, whether it's parks per 1,000 people or whatever. And you base it usually, not always, but usually on the existing level of service. So here's what we've got. We've got so much parkland per capita. We've got a level of service in roads of vehicle miles of capacity versus vehicle miles of travel. We got some kind of ratio that gets us to, that's our level of service. So existing level of service is really kind of built into the standards-based approach. You're almost always looking at the existing level of service. Sometimes you may say, okay, well, we'll take what we've got, we're going to add a little bit, and then we're going to divide by what we've got in the future. We're going to say this will be enough for 20 years, let's divide there. And that's typically fine as long as it produces a lower fee. But you should do an existing level of service analysis to make sure that's the case, not just assume it. Okay, so the alternative is really a plan-based or improvements-driven approach, more often used for probably roads than anything else. I mean, you can do plan-based for, say, a park fee, but in general, park fees are based on pretty standard ratios of parkland per 1,000 or sometimes, but no, I mean, I'll take that back. You can have a master plan that said, okay, we're going to have a neighborhood park every, serving, within so many feet of every neighborhood or whatever your standard is. You can do plan-based for parks too. But most commonly used for roads, sometimes the hard services, water and sewer in some cases. And often here, your master plan, you're using some kind of geographic or facility-specific basis. And what I mean by that is you're saying all roads will function at level of service D or better. Well, you got to look at every road to see if it meets that standard. That's facility-specific. Whereas a consumption base would basically say, we want this overall ratio in the whole system. We want it level of service D on average, not every road. So if you use that kind of standard, well, you're inevitably going to have some deficiencies. Well, not always, but often you're going to have some deficiencies if you're a growing community, depending on how aggressive your level of service is, how low it is or high it is. So anyway, but you use a long-range plan to establish the nexus between how much, we got a 20-year plan, we're expecting this much growth. If that growth happens, we're going to need these many improvements. We divide planned growth, planned cost by the growth to get our cost per service unit. Here, we're basically saying we're looking at the total cost of the system. Right now, the replacement cost, usually, if you're talking about the existing level of service, which sometimes confuses people because you're not using the impact fees to rebuild your existing facilities, you're using them for new facilities. But the standard-based approach, at least the incremental expansion version of it, which is one of the most common, basically, the concept is as we grow, we're going to need to increase our facilities. We've got a certain level now. We're going to have to at least increase it just to maintain our level of service by proportionally. So if we double, we're going to need twice as many parks, et cetera. Okay. But of course, you're not using the money to buy existing facilities. You're using the money to buy existing parks. So you want to know what's the replacement value of my existing parks. So if I built them today, what would it cost? Okay. So that's the main cost. And in both cases, of course, you're dividing a cost by something. And here you're dividing by capacity. And here you're dividing by growth. And sometimes it's confusing. What's the difference between capacity and demand? Because, for example, I used, population or dwelling units was a demand factor, right? Service unit for parks, for example. But it can also be a capacity factor in the sense of well, yeah. Well, yeah. Okay, growth is demand. That's capacity. So no, typically it's I'll take it back. I get confused too sometimes. Bear with me.
So do I.
Well, I think sometimes it blends. What's the capacity of a park system? It's the population that you can support with the parks, right? So under your desired level of service. So in a sense, it's a demand factor and a capacity factor. I guess that's the point I was hoping to make before I garbled it up. Okay, but you can have combinations of these. For example, you can use a standards-based approach to calculate your fee. You can have a master plan which identifies here's the improvements we're going to spend the money on. But the two are not tied together like they are with a plan-based approach. With a plan-based approach, you do your master plan, you base the fee on that, we got these projected costs, we got this much growth, It's all linked together. So you want to update your fees, you got to update your master plan. You want to change your master plan, you better update your fees. So the standard base gives you a lot more flexibility, and you can still have, tie it to this money will be spent on growth-related improvements that are identified in the master plan. Okay. So, but it's some people think, okay, we got more certainty with a plan-based approach. You can do both calculations and pick the lower one, but that lower one better be the existing one. So doing it that approach is like maybe appropriate for a community-facing approach you build out, where, okay, we may not have that many costs left to build. We don't want to get in the case like Fernandino Beach, where they decide they need all this parking, and then they do their study and they go, okay, we don't. We got the growth and we really didn't need those improvements. So sometimes you want to do a plan-based approach because you don't want to collect too much money. The incremental expansion may be appropriate when you're in the growth phase, but as you approach build out, maybe it's not so appropriate anymore. And you can also do different calculations for different components. I don't know, can you guys see the bottom of the slides? Are you having trouble seeing that? I'm guessing you probably are. Especially way back in the room, you're probably having trouble seeing it at all. We are going to put all the presentations up on the website, so don't despair if you can't see it right now or get a screen capture of it. And we're also, the ones that we're taping, we're going to have probably links to it, get that online too. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to tape every session. Turns out we got some technical difficulties. But we should get at least the basic ones. The basic impact fee basics ones. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of what I consider kind of questionable approaches. Well, maybe not kind of. I mean, this one just seems to me totally questionable, which is CIP-based fees. People think, we got a CIP, we got a list of projects, why can't we do a plan-based computation? And of course, you can do a plan-based computation. You can do projections for, we got a 5-year CIP, we can come up with some 5-year projections, divide the cost of the CIP that's potentially attributable to growth by how much growth we're expecting in those 5 years, and that's our cost per service unit. But the problem is, without a master plan, we haven't really established that 5 years of growth is really going to require all these improvements. Are in the next 5 years, are we playing catch up for the last 5 years? We don't know. No way to tell from that analysis. So you really need a master plan to establish that nexus. And we're also not identifying existing level of service or deficiencies. I guess you could do some kind of analysis to say all of these improvements are to roads that are currently working, or just look at those roads at a desired level of service, but then why the hell are you improving them, for example, people might ask. And if you are dealing with deficiencies, then you need to identify them, you need to address them. All right. So, and it's very difficult just looking at a set of projects to say, you really have to look at the system. Because, I mean, a set of projects is just a set of projects. And that's what the master plan helps you do, tie that connection back together, is that you're connecting to an analysis of the entire system. All right, and so the only other one I want to talk about I think is kind of questionable is the plan-based average approach, some people call it. It's been called a number of different things, and I'm hoping we can actually get some argument about this. Probably will. What do you think, Bob? Yeah? Yeah? Well, we'll see. Okay. So the concept of the plan-based average is that existing and new development both benefit from the improvements, so we'll just divide by everybody, right? We're not going to, it's plan-based, but normally with a plan-based, you take the cost of the improvements, you divide by the growth. The plan-based average approach said, well, we take the plan costs, we divide by all the development at the future, at the end of the future planning horizon, whatever that is. If it's a 20-year set of planned improvements, then we divide it by what's existing in the end of 20 years. So that's the basic concept. What I see is wrong with that is if there's no special benefit to new development, we can't show any particular benefit to new development compared to existing development, then why is new development paying a fee and existing development doesn't? Of course, we can't charge existing development an impact fee. So what's the basis? I mean, that's kind of the fundamental question. There's no existing level of service analysis. I mean, you do an existing level of service analysis, you can calculate the fee however you want, as long as you come up with a lower fee, you're good. And oftentimes, it is a pretty conservative methodology. And oftentimes, it will give you that result. But some consultants use this approach don't bother to do an existing level of service analysis. So on its face, it doesn't seem to me to be a valid methodology. You could probably go back and justify it after the fact. You get in court, you say, okay, well, we do have additional information and additional analysis that can justify it. So if you have if you do your existing level of service analysis, you got no deficiencies, you're not charging for a higher level of service, you're fine. If you do have deficiencies, then you got to pay the cost, and then there's issues there about how you pay it, and we'll really talk about that in the revenue credits session that's going to be in this room up next. So, and if we have time, I mean, we'll see how the discussion goes. If it lags, you know, we'll try to touch on some other topics. I mean, there's a lot of other areas besides what's the basic methodology and what are valid methodologies. Methodology ties into kind of everything. Like one thing is service areas. How big are your service areas? You got a citywide service area. You want to try to break it down into sub areas. And the key here, I think, is there needs to be some consistency between the area that is impacted and the area that benefits. They should be the same, primarily. I mean, you're going to have some overlap if you have multiple service areas, probably. But the primary benefit ought to be to the development within the service area. And that's often, there's a desire to have an impact fee or reduce impact fees for the downtown area, for example. And of course, the downtown area of most communities is tied into the whole community. Everybody uses it. It's like, okay, it's not just these roads are serving this little area. They're serving a huge area. So that becomes kind of difficult to define that as really, that's a service area. We can calculate a fee for that area specifically. Okay. Facility components, for example, roads, you charge for arterials only, arterial improvements. You include collectors. Do you include right-of-way? If you include right-of-way, you got to give credit for the right-of-way. If you don't include right-of-way, you get a lower fee, but you don't have to mess with all those developer credits. So lots of considerations there. So what components do you include? Water, you could charge just for the water treatment plant, not for the lines. With lines, you get into a whole bunch of like service area issues you might not get into with a central treatment plant that's serving the whole community. So feeds back into the service area discussion once again. Feeds into developer credits. We're having another session on developer credits that is affected by that. So it kind of like ties into a lot of things. So we're trying to sort of break up impact fees into these little packages. They don't really fit very nicely. I know I'm going on and going on. I said if we have time. I got also an interesting case study we could talk about if we have time. Okay. All right, well, let's get Bob's thing up here and figure out how to do that. There we go. Oh, now I'm editing it.
You're gonna change my slides?
No, sorry. I just, I hate using the mouse pad and stuff.
Yeah, maybe you want to just turn it over to the expert.
Yeah. You start your slideshow. Sorry.
Thank you, Clancy. Yeah, I was worried you were going to take up all that time because you didn't want to, get the rebuttal here.
Okay.
All right, so I want to try and keep it interesting, throw some maybe small hand grenades, maybe some larger bombs. We'll see. So in spite of what we heard today, that in lieu fees aren't necessarily impact fees, I think what's really important is that we realize this is a fairly large field we're operating in. There aren't just impact fees. Impact fees become linkage fees, which are just a more complicated form. There's mitigation fees, at least in California. We have the California Environmental Quality Act, and a lot of local governments actually use CEQA to impose impact fees as mitigation to environmental impacts. So I just want to remind us we're trying to design a system. We're talking about methodologies that need to apply across all these options. Now, I'm going to go back and suggest that it's not about the plan. It's not about the list of facilities. It's not about how you calculate this. You know, I tell people it's nothing more than eighth grade algebra. What we do, you know, you divide costs by units. How complicated can you get it? I think that really detracts from where the focus of from the policymakers down to the technicians and consultants needs to be in this business if you want to talk about basics. And that's on the facility standard. It's that first part of the dual nexus. This slide is another way of reiterating what we heard at breakfast, which is there's the dual nexus and then there's proportionality. I think if we keep our eyes on those three principles and be able to, at the end of the day, be able to stand up or be on the witness stand as an expert witness and be able to clearly articulate these 3 points, I think we're fine. Standards, we've talked about the need that new development has. It also may have impacts, referring to my CEQA example. If you have needs, then what you want to do is take those fee revenues and generate benefits. That's the other half of that dual nexus. If you have impacts, you want to maybe make sure that you're mitigating those impacts. So it's just a different way to look at it. Needs are responded to by providing benefits. Impacts generated are responded to by providing mitigations for those impacts. So you start with standards, and that's really the guts of my talk, and I could go home now. If all you come out of here is think about, well, what is my facility standard, I think you're going to win. The expenditure plans are how you're going to expend it. We heard about that this morning. You have to be careful how you expend it. You want to expend these revenues so that they help or they either benefit or mitigate the folks that are causing the need or generating the impact. And then finally, you want to take care of proportionality, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today. So I think going to standards, I think really the interesting discussion, we talk a lot about demand standards. And I'm a big fan of physical measures of the impact of growth. So I don't care, even if you've done this esoteric plan, as Clancy calls it, this plan-based fee. There's no plan-based fee. You got to go, what's behind the plan? Even if you brought together a potpourri of projects, I would start with, okay, how many square feet are those projects providing, or how many acres, or what sort of service, what's the physical measure of service those projects are providing? And I would frankly then go backwards and back into what is the standard that that plan represents, or what is the standard that drove the need for those for that design? What's the engineering standard? Like in a water system, we design for X gallons a day per household. You know, that's the standard. I think you gotta start with some physical measure of demand, even if you got to work backwards from this plan-based approach, which I think is kind of a silly way to start. I think you want to start with what your standards are. Now, what I think is interesting, which I've never heard talked about here, is, okay, we have a cost per unit, but where's that cost come from? What's inside that library? Does it include all kinds of gold-plated accessories and facilities? You know, so what are the design assumptions that drive the cost? And that actually, I think, is a part of this, the world we live in. We haven't talked about enough, which is, you know, I'll take a fire station as a simple example. If you have square feet of fire station per capita, typical way of examining fire station demand, but your existing stations were built 50 years ago, and you want to use this standard and now build new stations. You've got new construction standards. You've got, now you got to withstand earthquakes, you got to withstand hurricanes. So there's a lot of upgrading of the level of service that is funded by impact fees that's hidden by the notion of the design. Now, is that attackable? Is that defensible? I think you could say it's defensible because you have to design for today's standards. It's the same metric, square feet per capita, and the cost per the new square feet doesn't have to relate to what you had to, if you were going to replace that existing building as it's built today. But I think design, the assumptions behind design are an area that we could investigate more. And finally, then, you end up with a cost standard because you got to apply it to new development. You need $1 per unit. But to me, we spend all our time talking about these cost standards. In fact, I'd rather come up with a better name than cost standard. I think the cost standard is just a derivative of the assumptions you made about the physical connection between growth and the need for facilities, and the assumptions you made that went into the cost of those new facilities per square foot, the design. So to me, we're not focused where we should. But okay, Clancy wants to talk about incremental and plan-based, and there's all this language, and it's starting to seep into the court. There's a case in California, Lamour, very good case for practitioners, defended what's called, I think Clancy called it the incremental approach, and the court used that term in the language. I think we got to be careful about this kind of focus, because I'll say there's actually 5 ways to do a cost standard, or in terms of Clancy's methodologies, incremental, plan-based, there's 5 ways to do it, and I think these are all defensible. And I think there's always examples. I think Clancy was trying to take a pot shot at what I call the new facilities approach in the lower right, where you've got planned facilities divided by existing plus new growth. I can easily come up with several examples where that's completely defensible. So this is just the 8th grade algebra, but this to me is all derivative of some very important decisions you make up front about what's the need for these facilities, how do I define that, what assumptions do I make that go into the design of those facilities, and then of course, there's revenue credits and proportionality. So I don't want to say it's as simple, but I think the plan versus incremental is really not where our focus ought to be. So in wrapping up, let's keep our eyes on the prize, these legal standards that we got reminded about this morning. I think facility standard is the gold standard. I think if you can clearly articulate that metric, I think you're most of the way there, then assuming you use the fees as you planned on and they're proportional. Existing level of service is often but not always relevant. So I'll grant Clancy that yes, existing LOS is a very important metric for determining whether you're treating new development fairly, but it doesn't always apply. I've already trashed the standards-based versus plan-based approach. And revenue credits we're going to deal with in a separate session. Thanks very much.
Yeah, let's hear from Carson and Susan. You got...
Yeah, don't throw my slides up. I'll just talk. What Bob didn't tell you is he'll be spending the next few weeks on a witness stand defending his crazy California ideas. I think that there's some truth in both presentations. I tend to side more with Clancy on a lot of this stuff, and I think that a lot of what Bob talked about we experience only in California. It tends to be there's a sort of a different standard there, which I'll talk a little bit about. But I think that I'll just sort of going to randomly bring up some points here. I think that I do tend to agree with the traditional level of service analysis, but I do think there's some mitigating circumstances. For instance, parks and recreation. A lot of our clients around the country have moved away from their traditional neighborhood and community and regional park sort of program, and they're focusing on special purpose parks, skate parks, aquatic facilities, that sort of thing. And so it's not, the way they're doing business in the future isn't the way they did business in the past. And so it's very difficult to sort of use an existing level of service and have it be applicable to what you're going to do in the future. And so I do think there's some leeway for those types of situations where you don't have to do a strict level of service analysis. I do think you have to be very careful in how you craft that argument as part of the fee report. And one of the other things we also find with Parks and Recreation, which I think Clancy sort of touched on with the plan-based approach, is that, I mean, I can't tell you a community we haven't worked in that would love to have a higher level of service for parks. But most communities we work in do not have an adopted master plan for parks because it doesn't have a funding strategy associated with it. You know, everybody wants more parkland, and so that you have all sorts of problems with, you know, correcting those existing deficiencies. The other area I think where we can give some leeway is in multimodal transportation. A lot of communities we work with are approaching build-outs, or they're experiencing a lot of TOD and mixed-use type of development, and the focus has moved away from moving vehicles to moving people. And so in the past, you know, my perspective always was, well, if we're going to start doing bike lanes and sidewalks and that sort of thing, you don't have an existing level of service, so you're going to have to fund all of that through other revenue. Over time, my thinking on that has evolved, and we've been involved in some multimodal and mobility type fees, and I think that there's an argument to be made that, much like park, the future of transportation in certain communities doesn't lend itself well to a very strict level of service type of analysis. In terms of the buy-in or cost recovery approach, we sort of have a different idea for open systems, like parks and libraries and things like that. And we really call it more of a debt service approach, where basically you're trying to determine what share of new developments or what share of the debt service is germane to new development. And so, and I think that works well with an open system because you don't have a defined capacity like you do with a closed system like utilities. It's very easy to understand that we've got 3 million gallons of capacity left, and so new development is going to buy into that. And so we typically don't do buy-ins unless there is existing debt service on for open systems. Other ideas here. Let's see. I'm going to pick on Bob once again. I call it the California build-out approach. We see a lot of this in California, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, Bob, but my perception of California we've done quite a bit of work there, is that on the surface, the California Impact Fee Act seems very, very stringent. But what actually goes on in practice in a lot of jurisdictions defies imagination. It would never pass muster in any state that we work in. And we see a lot of fees, and I call it the California build-out approach, where, and I think Clancy in his presentation sort of outlined this, is where you basically have a wish list, and you say, here's what we're going to build over 20 years, and here's the increase in service units, whether it's population, employment, trips, or whatever, and here's your impact fee. And there's no level of service analysis, and it really is a wish list. And I think that a plan-based approach is very dangerous unless we are talking about a closed system, because there is a measurable capacity there. And we have moved away as a firm over the last 10 years or so of doing plan-based transportation fees unless they're focused on the 5 to 10 year period, because as we all know, a lot can happen in 20 years. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that, you know, we'd have iPhones that are doing all this stuff that we're doing? So the same thing happens with transportation. So we're taking more of a short and medium term take on things. And what else? I mean, I think Clancy sort of touched on this. I think Bob also touched on this. But you know, there's a lot of leeway given the consultant when determining the impact fee, and so there's a lot of different variables that go into determining, you know, what approach you're going to use, what kind of standards you're going to use, et cetera. But some of the idea or issues that come up are, you know, what's the available data to support the methodology? Do you have adopted policies? Do you have adopted CIP, or is everything sort of iffy? What's the current level of service in your community? You know, I mean, you take a different approach in a community approaching build out than in a greenfield community. So I just have some random thoughts there.
Well, for better or worse, you're going to end up with 4 slightly but fairly significantly different perspectives on things today. So hopefully that's helpful rather than confusing. I'm actually more aligned with Bob. I think that the level of service decision is the most important policy decision your elected officials can make. Whether they're paying for it out of impact fees, taxes, assessments, whatever, whether they realize it or not, when they adopt a CIP, they have in fact adopted an LOS.
Same as facility standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the language I used, but I agree. You
Yeah.
can use either.
So, but what they haven't done is decide what that level of service is going to be in the future. So in other words, if they just adopt a CIP and don't analyze what the facility standard they really want or what the community wants, then they will inevitably have a declining level of service, because as new growth occurs, that CIP, more people using the facilities, inevitably, unless they add more projects to the CIP, the LOS, the functional LOS is going to decline. It also is a legally significant decision. I talked earlier about Florida having now this non-deferential review of impact fees. Local governments have to prove preponderance of the evidence. If you can take one step back from that, I'm thinking that we could argue to courts the decision on the level of service or the facility standards that feeds into the capital improvements plan is inherently a legislative, basic, bedrock decision for local governments to make, as Jim talked about this morning. That who's going to take care of this stuff? Who's going to build this stuff? Okay, it's local governments. Once you make that decision, it's math. It really is. It can be complicated math. It can be really simple math. Making that decision of where you're drawing the line, you can look at it as we're drawing the line between what's new growth costs and what's deficiencies. That sets a facility standard. So I agree with Bob that it all comes back to that basic decision. And if we talk about it that way to the courts, I'm hopeful that we can continue to bring in historical judicial deference to local government decisions on things that are inherently local government business. So I'm hoping that that works out. We'll see over time, because the courts in general and the legislatures are eating away at any deference to local government decision making. And inroads against home rule authority are occurring all across the country, and very much so in Florida. One other area where I probably agree more with Bob than with the others, at least in the way it was presented, is everybody likes to say, well, you can't impose a new or higher level of service through impact fees. I disagree. I think if carefully done, it can be done. Sarasota County did it years ago with Park LOS. If you say that, and this is the attorney slippery slope type argument, if you say you can never have new growth contribute towards an increased LOS, then you're saying you can never have an impact fee for a facility you don't already have. Okay, so say you have no aquatic centers, and all of a sudden you decide, gosh, for whatever reason, we want our community to be known for its aquatic centers. But never had them before. Does that mean you can't have an impact fee for it? I don't agree. I think you can. You've got to be careful how you do it. You've got to have very, very clear political commitment. As I recall, in Sarasota, we had already approved bonds. I don't recall when they were issued in the process, that would get the existing development to the proposed level of service. And we'll leave the credit discussion for the later session. But so I think that can be done. And it worries me when statements like that are made in consultant reports, and begging your pardon, Clancy, in presentations like this, that present categorical statements like that, that I think we end up boxing ourselves in down the line, because then that gets stated as this is the rule. I think Tyson said that, or no, it was Jim, I think, was saying somewhere this morning that somebody had said, oh, you can't spend impact fees to expand an existing road. Well, those little worms get out there and they stay. So, you know, if you're concerned about this area, concerned about maintaining local government's abilities to the maximum extent possible in what they choose to do, be careful how you use your language and be careful what you state as categorical rules. There really aren't that many categorical rules in this. That's why I love this area of law. So anyway.
Open it up. We only got half an hour.
My turn.
You've already had your turn.
I know, I had a long turn, but you know, I put this session together, so I get some leeway here. Yeah, and I want to say, yeah, I appreciate all of the comments from our panel, contributions really, and I don't know that we're all that have really uncovered that much disagreement. I'm really trying to ferret out where's the disagreement here, because Bob, you were saying, okay, the key is really the facility standard, and it's true. I was focusing on more the mechanics of how do you calculate the fee, but that was based on the idea that the fundamental legal principle is the existing level of service. You don't charge the new guy more than existing development has contributed in the past.
There's situations, as Susan mentioned, where you could.
Okay, okay. Well, I think that's a good discussion to have. I think that's a good discussion to have. And so I do think facility standards or level of service or whatever you call it is fundamental. I mean, that's really the
We can agree on that.
yeah, we definitely agree on that. And as for Susan's point about the, can't you base the fee on a higher facility standard? Absolutely. I mean, I don't think I said that. My point is you really need to do that existing level of service analysis. I mean, you need to know. I mean, if you're doing a higher level of service, you should document that. Yes, this is higher than what we have
compared
today.
to what? What it's higher compared to what? I mean,
Compared to
we're in
existing.
radical agreement. You need to know that existing level. If you're going to do something higher, you've got to know what the difference is, to know how much higher and how to make sure you're treating development fairly. So yeah, we are in radical agreement on it.
Good, okay. Glad we got that cleared up. And I do want to say, but back to that thing about, okay, you know, there's standards-based and there's plan-based, and those are pretty broad categories in my mind. You know, I mean, buy-in fees for water and wastewater based on capacity. Well, yeah, I mean that's existing and new service units, but that's also existing capacity usually, right? So I think that's a standards-based in my mind. You're not dividing by growth. You're not dividing all the costs by growth. You're dividing basically the costs you've already got, your cost of your existing facilities by the capacity of that facility. So that seems to me clearly a standards-based approach. If you just look at what the denominator is, kind of is the key, and I guess that's the kind of the
What
point I
I'm
was
saying
trying
is
to
it's
make.
all standards-based. Even your plan goes back to a standard, and you should draw it out of the plan. And even if it seems like you're going in a loop, I would define the standard first and show how that got you to the plan. And I will agree with Clancy, with Tyson on these Carson, Clancy. How long have we known each other? With Carson on these build out. What do you call it in California? These California build that is ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. You wouldn't find my authorship on anything like that.
I had nothing to add. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, we've been involved in fees that you charge for an increased level of service, and I mean, obviously, you have to show how you're going to correct that existing deficiency, and so we give a lot of scrutiny to the funding plan and do the projections to see if that could actually happen. But it's very rare that we see communities willing to pony up that money, unless they're particularly new communities. Like I remember we did impact fees for Maricopa, Arizona, when they first incorporated, and they were literally operating out of trailers. And so, when your existing development base is like this, and the delta for the next 10 years is like this, it's very easy to see how it makes sense to, I think in their case, it was leveraging $4 million in general fund revenue for a windfall, I think, of about $24 million in impact fees in order to get themselves up to the level of service that they wanted. But we get a lot of clients that, particularly with parks, that say, well, our plan and our adopted level of service is 5 acres per thousand. Well, you're currently at 3. So we don't do the impact fees on the 5 unless you can show how you have a funding plan. A lot of times, particularly out west, we've worked in Colorado where clients have actually passed a local option sales tax that's dedicated to parks, and so they can show how they're going to make up that difference and achieve that level of service.
You want to open it up?
Okay, I think we'll wrap up the formal part of the discussion here and the panel discussion and try to get a little Q&A going. We've got 2 microphones, so we'll leave one on the table here. And I'm going to walk around, and anybody that wants to talk, we can sort of pass this around. Here you go.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on the topic Carson just mentioned about cases where your existing level of service may be 3 acres and adopted level is 5. Well, I've seen a number of impact fee studies where the adopted level of service may actually be lower than existing level of service because an asset was just acquired, but there's no intention of maintaining that temporarily higher level of service through CIP plans. It's just a matter of timing. And yet the impact fee is based on the existing level of service, which is actually less than the adopted level of service. And I've had trouble reconciling that in my mind because the benefit that will be conferred in the future won't be at the existing higher level of service. So I'm just curious as to your all's thoughts.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. That was actually one of the things I was going to bring up on my slides if we'd have used them. And that's not a knock. I made my slides last night because I thought Clancy was the only one presenting. So, but it's an interesting concept because we get into that in our fiscal impact practice where if we're building parks, for instance, in our model and we're doing it on a marginal basis, the actual snapshot of where you are in terms of level of service can be misleading because of the lag time between acquiring, when did you last build the park, the lag time to acquire and construct the new park. It's the same with staff. Like, for instance, if you just hired a trash crew and your level of service is, every 800 houses you have to hire a crew, but you've had 200 housing units since the last crew, to take a snapshot today is misleading because it doesn't account for that slack capacity. So we do allow leeway to a certain extent on defining these levels of service in open systems if the level of service is not that far off. Like, for instance, if the level of service is 3 and you're currently at 3.2 or 2.8, we'll make that argument in the report itself that this is the adopted level of service, and because of the vagaries of acquiring the parks, then that's the reason why the literal interpretation may be what it is. But I think that's an excellent point, and I don't see a lot of studies that take that into consideration. It's a very hard line drawn in the sand of this is where we are at this snapshot in time.